Thanks for that reading, Tim. So, thank you for all coming out this evening, in spite of the chilly weather, to hear this topic. It's one that's quite close to my heart. It's a study I initially looked at midway through last year, particularly in the context of doing some work on Psalm 42. And I selected tonight's title several months ago, but didn't realise it would have quite so much meaning to me as it has in the last couple of weeks, dealing with some significant family challenges. So, just a brief overview of what we're going to look at tonight. We're going to start by a brief reflection on talking to God. How should we do it? We're then going to look briefly at the Psalms at a fairly high level, 3 categories of Psalms. We're then going to look in a bit more detail at the genre of Lament Psalms in particular, and then we're going to spend some time looking at Psalms 42 and 43. Out of that, we're going to highlight 7 typical elements of Lament Psalms and how they contribute to how Lament Psalms work. We're going to spend a brief bit of time talking about God's loyal love, his Hesed. Talk briefly about Jesus and lament in the New Testament, and then summarise what we've learned. So, how do we talk about God and how do we talk to God? These are really fundamental questions for believers, and the way that we address them speaks right to the heart of our religious thinking. Talking about God's not easy. And to quote a famous Protestant theologian, Karl Barth, we ought to speak of God. We are human, however, and so cannot speak of God. We ought, therefore, to recognise both our obligation and our inability, and by that very recognition, give God the glory. God's so far beyond human comprehension that it seems presumptuous for us to talk about God and pretend that we can actually wrap our time-bound brains around a timeless being. And I want to quote a slightly longer section from another Christian author talking about the greatness of God. So this author was addressing a young person looking to be baptised into their particular church. So he says, in reference to thinking about God, "Do not pronounce judgment on the infinite, nor suppose God to be like a bad prime minister. Do not suppose him powerless, or if he is powerful, malignant. Do not address your mind to criticisms of the Creator. Do not pretend to know his categories. Do not take his universe in your hand and point out its defects with condescension. Do not think that he's a greater potentate, a manner of president of the United Galaxies. Do not think that because you know so few human beings, that he is in a comparable, though more favourable, position. Do not think it absurd that he should know every sparrow or the number of the hairs of your head. Do not compare him with yourself, nor suppose your human love to be an example to shame him. He is not greater than Plato or Lincoln, nor superior to Shakespeare and Beethoven. He is their God. Their powers and their gifts proceeded from him. In infinite darkness, they pored with their fingers over the very first word of his book of knowledge." So why am I labouring this point about the greatness of God, the superiority of God, and this sense of God being something so much greater and beyond us? Well, the reason is I want us to consider and come to a realisation of just what a daring and audacious thing it is that we do when we venture to speak to God in prayer. So given how daring it is that we should speak to God, in spite of how much superior he is to us, how much he is beyond our comprehension, how ought we to address him? Should we grovel and scrape before him? Should we heap up titles and honorifics to flatter him? Well, the biblical example is quite clear. If you want to look at Psalm 3, we've got plenty of examples in the Psalms of how we should go about talking to God. Psalm 3, let's look at how Psalm 3 opens. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying to me, there is no help for you in God. Or again, if you flick over a couple of pages, Psalm 8. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You can keep looking at different Psalms. None of them have any great elaborate address to God. The psalmist gets straight to the point. And we see the same example in the Lord's Prayer. It just begins quite simply, our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. And then it gets on with the prayer. So, moving to the Psalms more generally now. The Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann proposes a framework for the Psalms, which I think works quite well. He divides the Psalms into three main types. Psalms of orientation, Psalms of disorientation, and Psalms of reorientation. And implicit in that, obviously, is a sense of process. We start in a place of orientation. We're challenged by various life circumstances and perhaps enter a period of disorientation and confusion. But hopefully we come through that and reorient ourselves and recenter ourselves. So we see Psalms that address people in all of these situations. The Psalms of orientation are the kinds of Psalms that reflect a settled and orderly outlook on life. The world all works according to set rules, whereby good people are rewarded with good things, bad people are punished with bad things. So if you're still at the start of Psalms, Psalm 1 is a classic of this genre. Happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, take the path that sinners tread, or sit in the seat of scoffers. Because, in the end, verses 4 to 6, the wicked are destroyed, the good prosper. You might say it's a fairly simplistic outlook. The Psalms of disorientation, or what tonight we're talking of as the Lament Psalms, reflects basically the entire opposite. There seems to be no rhyme or reason to life. Good people suffer, whilst bad people prosper. God seems just entirely absent and uncaring. And so the psalmist in these psalms calls on God to show himself and to act decisively in the world like he's done in the past. And the example we're going to look at tonight is Psalms 42 and 43. If you want to sort of get a handle on how these psalms work, you might compare the Psalms of orientation to the book of Proverbs, where life seems to follow certain set patterns. Good people, if they do the right thing, are blessed. Bad people, fools, in the end perish. If you want to compare some other literature to these Psalms of disorientation, you might instead look at Ecclesiastes, a bit of a bleak outlook. Life seems meaningless at times, or even the book of Job. Finally, Psalms of reorientation reflect the aftermath of a time of disorientation. The psalmist has gone through a period of great discomfort and trial, but they've come through the other end, and they now see God in a new light. They begin to participate once more in the life of their religious community with renewed vigour and enthusiasm, but perhaps we might say without that naive outlook of good people are blessed, bad people are punished. For example, a good example of this particular type of psalm is Psalm 30, which is an expression of thankfulness following a period of grave illness. Not going to look at that in any great detail, but you can flick through that in your own time. Now, these categories are fairly broad, and in some psalms you might see more than one of these categories. So you might see a psalm that progresses from a place of disorientation into a place of reorientation, from trial to thankfulness and an expression of, thanks that God has delivered the psalmist from a time of trial. So often you'll see that in one psalm, but broadly speaking, these categories I think work very well to describe the kinds of situations we're seeing illustrated in these psalms. So why focus tonight on these somewhat depressingly negative psalms about people in trial, questioning God, doubting God? Well, I want to share with you just briefly a short clip from the scholar I mentioned earlier, Walter Brueggemann, and he actually I read several of his books, and they sort of really fired my passion for this topic in the first place. So now I didn't think about sound when I set this up, so I'll just try and turn up the volume as best we can and see how we go.
Almost 1/3 of the 150 Psalms are laments, complaints, protests. That's a lot. And for most of the church, Anglicans probably are a little bit different, but not much. For most of the church, the only psalm of disorientation that we use is Psalm 22, because we can't avoid it, because Jesus quoted it on the cross. So it does come up in the lectionary and in the liturgy, but we, by and large, are free to neglect those others. So what we do is to deny the rhetoric of the church, the language of disorientation. And as I said last night, I believe that blanking out that third of the book of Psalms invites people to great guilt, so if something's wrong, it's my fault. Or it invites people to great denial that I have to keep pretending it's working when in fact it is not working. So what I want to suggest is that what the Psalms of disorientation do is to lift up and call attention to the reality of human loss and human pain without making moral judgments about it, about whose fault it is. It is simply a given of human life that needs to be processed theologically. And these Psalms, it seems to me, are so important because they are models of the way in which ancient Israel and then the church learns to have faith in the midst of disorientation and pain and loss, and learns to worship and pray in the midst of disorientation and pain and loss.
So, So I hope you caught some or most of that. But just to sort of summarise what Brueggemann's saying there, what I think what he's highlighting is the fact that the real value of these psalms is the way that they legitimate that sense of confusion, disorientation and loss that we sometimes feel at critical moments in our lives. These psalms give us permission to cry to God in despair, to ask him why we don't feel his presence at a given time, to demand that he act faithfully and restore us to a place of normality. As Brueggemann says, they don't make us assume we've done something wrong to deserve this problem, and they don't encourage us to pretend that everything's fine and that we're just cruising through life without a worry. They encourage us to be frank and honest with God and with each other as well. But they also encourage us that once we've weathered our trial, they encourage us to join in worship of God with renewed vigour and a new appreciation of how God works in our lives and how he works in the wider world. So I want to take some time now to look at an example in Psalm 42 and 43 and just have a look at some of the nuts and bolts of how a lament psalm works. So when we approach any biblical text, one of the first things we have to do is investigate the context. And context falls into two different categories: the literary context and the historical context. So the literary context is the sections of text around the section we're looking at. It also includes things like the genre of the text we're looking at, because obviously that affects how we're going to look at it. Historical context is obviously, the setting, the reason why this psalm or piece of text was written in the first place, the historical things it talks about, all that kind of stuff. So the author, the date, all of those kinds of things. So when we look at psalms, typically we don't get much in the way of historical context. There's sometimes a hint in the superscription of a psalm. So if you're anywhere near Psalm 3 still, that's the title of Psalm 3 is a psalm of David when he fled from his son Absalom. So it gives us some historical context there, but that's fairly rare, really. The superscription to Psalm 42 that we're looking at tonight says it's a maskil of the Korahites, or a maskil of the sons of Korah. And this probably indicates it had some sort of place in an ancient hymn collection of sorts, perhaps a collection of songs that were sung in the temple at certain times of the year or as part of certain festivals or feasts. From the superscription, we can perhaps infer that it was written by one of the sons of Korah. And some of the other things in the psalm that would bear that out is the fact that it has references to places in the north of Israel. And we know that the Korahites actually had their inheritance in many of the northern parts of Israel. There's also references in the psalm to the speaker participating quite actively in the temple worship, and we know that the Korahites were temple singers. So all of that sort of tends to make us infer that the writer was one of the sons of Korah. That said, though, I don't think we ought to be especially bothered by the fact that the Psalms don't have much historic context, because they're poetry, and in some respects, no context is kind of the point. As deeply expressive works of poetry, they're always intended to speak beyond their original context. They're always intended to be accessible to believers and worshippers all through the ages, not just the person in that time of crisis. They typically express sentiments that all believers can embrace at certain points of their life. And so it's no surprise that we see the Psalms featuring prominently in both old and new Christian music with very little adaptation. Although, just as an aside, I did find it quite difficult when I was preparing this class to find music that actually appropriately reflects the spirit of the Lament Psalms. And I think maybe Christian composers have typically preferred the Psalms of orientation and reorientation, where everything is happy and we're praising God and joyful, rather than drawing on some of those more melancholy, depressing psalms. Or perhaps I'm just really bad at finding good music. But that aside, I think the lack of historical context for psalms in some ways is what gives them their power and is what makes them timeless. Now, in terms of the literary context and structure, it's quite apparent that Psalm 42 and 43 were originally one psalm. One of the things that first makes us think this is that Psalm 43 has no superscription. in spite of the fact that 42 and 44 both do. So, in addition to that, we see several themes and several repeated phrases across both psalms, and in particular, this one I've got on the screen here. Why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my help and my God. And we see that in 42 verse 5, 42 verse 11, and then concluding the psalm in 43 verse 5. So given we're treating both of these psalms together as one psalm, here's how I think we can break it down structurally. Basically following those little refrains throughout, I think that's a good divider of the different sections. So Psalm 42 verses 1 to 5, we see the metaphor of thirst. The psalmist is thirsting for God's presence and can't find God. And then we have this sort of strange reversal of that metaphor. And now in verses 42 verse 6 through to the end of 42 verse 11, the psalmist instead talks about drowning. So in verse 7, deep calls to deep at the thunder of your cataracts. All your waves and billows have gone over me. And so we have sort of an inversion of that original metaphor. Now, instead of having no water, the psalmist is drowning in water. I think, you see this cycle of emotion. And I think, we feel that at times in our own lives. We're at one end of the spectrum, and then suddenly circumstances are completely opposite, and we realise the other extreme isn't better. So we see that in those first two sections of Psalm 42. And then in 43, we start to see the psalmist changing his attitude and turning around a little bit and focusing on the need for deliverance and a plea to God for deliverance. Psalm 43 focuses more on looking ahead to a time when the psalmist will be restored to something like the state he was in before this crisis befell him. So that's the basic structure. So what makes this a lament psalm? Well, the Old Testament scholar Longman suggests there's 7 elements typically to a lament psalm. Not every psalm has all of these elements, but generally it's got several of them. And in this psalm, I'm just going to go briefly through these different elements and see how they relate. So the first element, an invocation to God, calling on God to in some way, calling upon the character of God in some way, invoking something about God. In 42 verse 8, we see the psalmist invokes God's steadfast love, his chesed, and we'll return to that theme later on. In 43 verse 3, we also see the psalmist calls on God to send forth his light and his truth to bring the psalmist back into presumably the temple worship. We see a plea to God for help, mainly in 43, not so much in 42. So in 43 verse 1, this second psalm opens with, "Vindicate me, O God, defend my cause." And then there's a further plea in verse 3. "Send out your light and your truth and let them lead me. Let them bring me to your holy hill and to your dwelling." So it's asking God to bring the psalmist back to the place where he can worship and be involved once more. This number 3 really is the key to a lament psalm. It's complaint. It's about saying there's something badly wrong. And we see complaint mainly in 42. So 42 verse 2, we see, "My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and behold the face of God?" God seems to be absent. Again in verse 7, "Deep calls to deep at the thunder of your cataracts. All your waves and your billows have gone over me." The psalmist feels like he's just overwhelmed and drowning. Verses 9 and 10 of 42. "I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why must I walk about mournfully because the enemy oppresses me? As with a deadly wound in my body, my adversaries taunt me, whilst they say to me continually, 'Where is your God?'" And again in 43 verse 2. You are the God in whom I take refuge. Why have you cast me off? Why must I walk about mournfully because of the oppression of the enemy? So this sense of God's absence, this sense of loss, and this sense of carrying a burden about and being taunted by enemies, this really is the crux of the Lament Psalms, really. This fourth one, I don't think we really see in this psalm. There's not a confession of sin. There's not really an assertion of innocence, although it's kind of implied in 43 verse 1 a little bit. The psalmist asking for vindication sort of suggests he's been hard done by and wronged. So that's not really an element in this one, but it's quite common in the other psalms, particularly a sense of, I haven't done anything wrong. Why is all this happening to me? Also, number 5, we see in some psalms quite violent sentiments expressed about what the psalmist wants to do to their enemies. We don't really see that in this psalm either. And I think the reason for that is that the psalmist is too caught up in their own depression to actually feel violent towards another person. This sixth element, confidence in God's response, that I think we do see throughout this psalm, and in particular in that refrain that we mentioned earlier. Why are you cast down on my soul, and why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my help and my God. The way I read this psalm, and I sort of envision the psalmist saying these words, I think in 42 verse 5, towards the start of the psalm, and 42 verse 11 right in the middle there, I sort of envision the psalmist sort of muttering these words to themselves and not really being fully convinced of what they're saying and what those words mean. But then as we see the tenor of the psalm shift in 43, I think that final chorus at the end of 43 is more optimistic. It's more the psalmist actually believes what he's saying a little bit more. He's perhaps talked himself into actually believing this little chorus. This final element, hymn or blessing, we see this in a lot of the psalms when we see it turning from depression to God's deliverance. There's a promise of praise in verse 4 of 43. Then I'll go to the altar of God, to God my exceeding joy, and praise you with the harp, O God my God. But really, in the end, I don't think this psalm is totally optimistic. And personally, I think the psalmist is really in the depths of depression throughout the psalm. And I don't think that really fully lifts by the end of the psalm. A couple of other points I want to briefly note. I'm not going to go through each verse individually, but I'm just going to pull out a few other themes throughout. We've already noted that phrase that crops up in 5:11 and at the end of 43, that little refrain. But there's also another repeated phrase that we see in Psalm 42 verse 3 and Psalm 42 verse 10. Where is your God? The adversaries taunt the psalmist, saying to him continually, where is your God? Now the psalmist puts this phrase in the mouth of his enemies, but I think really, given the general tenor of the psalm and the lack of specifics about who these enemies are, this is perhaps really just a recurring intrusive thought that the psalmist is having, feeling abandoned by God, not feeling a sense of God's presence. Another similar phrase, a related phrase, occurs in 42 verse 9 and 43 verse 2. Why must I walk about mournfully because the enemy oppresses me? So whatever the specifics of the psalmist's crisis were, we know it's weighing the psalmist down everywhere they go. It's like the modern metaphor that we sometimes use talking about depression, the black dog. It goes around everywhere that depressed person goes, and it can't be shaken. Sometimes it's able to be ignored and forgotten, but always it's there. And we get that sort of sense from that recurring phrase, "Why must I walk about mournfully as the enemy oppresses me?" This problem goes around everywhere that the psalmist goes. Interesting point about the title for God used in this psalm. It's always Elohim throughout, which is really an impersonal way to talk about God. Elohim just means a God, any God. Only once, in verse 42, verse 8, does the psalmist use the divine name Yahweh. When he recalls, and this is something he doesn't do anywhere else in the psalm, he recalls that God is a God of steadfast love, which is the Hebrew word chesed, which is sometimes rendered in other translations, loyal love. And that was mentioned briefly this morning in the context of David looking after Mephibosheth. I want to talk just briefly about what this term means in relation to God and how it's used in the Old Testament. The word's very evocative. It sort of evokes more than just pity, more than just love, more than just altruistic kindness. It's got a sense of obligation in it, which is why it's translated steadfast love or loyal love. It's got this sense of obligation built in. And this is a theme that we see all the way through the Old Testament and in the New Testament as well, but particularly in the Israelite consciousness. God, despite being this supreme being, willingly binds himself to humans in covenant obligation. We see this in the promises to Abraham. God makes a covenant with Abraham. God again makes a covenant with Israel at Sinai. And God again makes a covenant with David. In modern language, we might say that God, despite being the supreme power of the universe and holding all the cards, in spite of all that, he's happy to make a deal with puny little human beings. He's happy to almost humour them into a bargain and tying himself to this obligation to human beings. We've got nothing to bargain with and we've got nothing to offer but our own loyalty, our own sense of obligation to God. And yet God's willing, on the basis of that, to bind himself to human beings like us. And it's this thought of God's loyal covenant love that gives the psalmist just that tiny glimmer of hope in the middle here in verse 42, verse 8. And it's that point at which he thinks of God in personal terms and uses God's personal name. So that's all I really want to say about Psalm 42 and 43 in particular. Just a few key points there that I wanted to highlight so you get a sense of what the Lament Psalms are like and how they function. I want to make a few brief comments now about Jesus and the Lament Psalms before we summarise and conclude. So in the Lament Psalms, we see people in crisis. We see people who feel like God's absent from their lives, that he's almost closing his eyes to their crisis. And in response, they call on him to act out of his covenant love like he has done in the past. God's loyal covenant love compelled him to bring the Israelites out of Egypt with a mighty display of power. The book of Exodus opens with God remembering the promises he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and because of that, feeling obliged to help this people who frankly didn't know about him or care about him. And similarly, we see this somewhat in the Gospels when we see individuals approaching Jesus to be healed. They have to first ask him to be healed. He doesn't just heal them when he sees their need. He's not blind to their situations, but he does wait for them to recognise their need and articulate it to him. And just as a way to illustrate this point, I want to look at a particular incident in Mark chapter 10. So if you want to turn to Mark chapter 10, I just want to look briefly at the incident of the blind man Bartimaeus. So Mark chapter 10, and verse 46 to 52. So Jesus and his disciples come to Jericho, and as he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." And many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. The whole crowd knew that this was Bartimaeus the blind man, and I'm sure it was evident to Jesus as well. But he says to the blind man, "What do you want me to do for you?" And I think this is like God in the Psalms. He waits for us to faithfully articulate our need and give hopeful expression to the desire that God can and will act to resolve the problem we're facing. Again, looking at the example of Jesus, if we still have some doubt about the appropriateness of questioning God's action in our lives, or apparent lack thereof, let's not forget that Jesus himself used the Lament Psalms. As Brueggemann mentioned earlier in that short video, Jesus on the cross quotes Psalm 22, and in particular he quotes the poignant opening words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And if Jesus sometimes felt abandoned by God, I don't think that it's morally reprehensible for us to feel those same feelings and express them in our own times of crisis. So what do we learn from the Lament Psalms in summary? I think we learn that it's okay to be upset and even angry about life's circumstances at times, and to tell God about those feelings and express that to God. It's okay to wonder sometimes why God seems to ignore us, why he seems to be absent and sometimes seems to be unconcerned. It's important, though, to remember in this context and in these times that God is a God of loyal love, a God that keeps his promises even in times of crisis. And in all this, we need to retain faith that God can and will act as he has done for believers in the past. And it's important, as we come out of these periods of trial, to focus on that period of reorientation, returning to a life of worship, perhaps an actual return to meeting with believers after a period of absence, getting involved in the community with new vigour, not seeing everything the way you used to necessarily, but with fresh eyes and perhaps more mature eyes, perhaps a less naive perspective that doesn't ignore past trial, but absorbs it and lets it change us for the better. Something Amy and I were discussing when we've been talking about this is that I think our gut instinct is to think of these psalms as almost turning one's back on God, but really it's the opposite. These people aren't walking away from God in a time of trial. They're saying to God, why is this trial happening? They're actually, in times of crisis and in times when they sense God's absence, they're turning around to God and asking for him to come back. And so really, they're an expression of deep faithfulness, not of abandonment of God. So there's more I could say, but that's sort of all I have scripted for tonight. I found this study really very helpful for me in my own personal life, and in particular my prayer life. So I hope that it's been helpful to you too. And I think we've probably got some time for brief comments and questions if anyone's got anything they'd like to say. before we conclude? All right, we'll leave it there then. Thank you for your attention.